Let me look at the ASEAN. ASEAN seeks to pursue more inclusive growth, and by this we mean more equitable both across the ASEAN member countries and within each individual ASEAN member country, by widening and strengthening the interlinkages among the ASEAN countries and again within the ASEAN countries. And here we talk about 4 types of linkages. Institutional linkages, and right now in the ASEAN Plan of Action, it is through the so-called Initiative for ASEAN Integration, which is really a mechanism for compensating the more affluent or the more advanced ASEAN countries being able to compensate the weaker ones, usually the so-called CLMV countries, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. But as an aside, I'd like to say that often it feels like the least are really CLMP, because Vietnam is already ahead of the Philippines in many ways. Now, on the infrastructure, again, infrastructure itself is being used to link together the ASEAN countries to have more inclusive development. And here, there's very deliberate efforts across the ASEAN in connecting us via transport facilities, whether by land, by air, and by water. We in the Philippines are particularly disadvantaged. We are sort of detached and separated by water from most of the rest of ASEAN. So we can only advocate for the ASEAN roll-on, roll-off network as our way to also get into this interlinkage via infrastructure. And then, of course, the economic linkage, which is the most prominent, the so-called ASEAN Economic Community, or AEC 2015, which a lot of people seem to be worried about. But this is really going to be pursued through closer interdependencies, especially through strategic regional value chains. Now, I don't have the time to elaborate on that, but one of the quite noteworthy observations about ASEAN integration economically is that we are not anymore competing in terms of trade in goods that we all produce. Instead, we are trading in products that all belong to the same industry, because much of the countries of ASEAN are part of a value chain wherein, for example, the Philippines exports motor vehicle components to Thailand, and Thailand assembles the motor vehicles and exports it to the rest of ASEAN. Philippines also assembles a lot of the electronic circuit boards, which are further assembled into finished products somewhere else, and most of them also in other parts of ASEAN. In short, it's a value chain linkage in the trade relationships. It's no longer a competition, it's a complementation. And finally, the people-to-people linkages. That's the in fact, most obvious, in fact, and in fact, sometimes the least highlighted among the interlinkages that could lead to this more inclusive development. And the very tangible ways of doing this would be having greater labor mobility across the ASEAN countries, more intra-ASEAN tourism, academic exchanges, and I'd like to argue that both professors and students across ASEAN universities ought to be traveling to each other's universities and having more exchange. Even mutual disaster assistance, especially because most of the ASEAN countries are particularly disaster prone. If we come to the rescue of each other whenever we are in troubles like we are now in the Philippines, for example, then again, more of these people-to-people interlinkage. Those are the pathways. But in this conference in the past 3 days, we have been also, in effect, arguing that the vehicle to inclusive growth is this social solidarity economy that we've all been talking about, captured in a nutshell in this description of an economy that puts human beings and social relationships back at the core of economic activities. And let me bring the context of all of this. My friend, of course, and our own solidarity economy guru, Dr. Ben Quiñones, likes to point out that the market economy is marked inherently by conflict. Consumers are out to seek the lowest prices, but producers are out to seek the highest prices for their products. Workers are out to seek the highest wages they can get, but the employers are out to pay the lowest wages that they can get away with. And borrowers are out to seek the lowest interest for the loans that they borrow, but the lenders are out to get the highest interest they could charge for the loans that they lend. So there is this inherent tension or inherent conflict in the so-called non-solidarity economy, in the market neoliberal, sometimes we say, economy that we all know of. So the modern economy is built on diametrically conflicting motives among its key players. That is far from solidarity. Of course, Adam Smith, father of modern economics, argued that that conflict is in fact natural and even necessary for market efficiency. He argued that with large numbers of players and free competition, market forces will automatically yield the right allocation of resources because of this invisible hand of the market economy. So there'll be the right allocation of resources, goods, and services. The problem is, right, in this sense, simply means efficient allocation. But it's not exactly going to lead to fair or an equitable allocation of resources. So that invisible hand is unable to ensure fair or equitable. And so there will be winners and losers, and win-win outcomes are the exception rather than the rule. And in the end, the market economy, in a sense, dehumanizes the economy, and we sort of forget about the human beings being at the core of the economy. And so, we go on and at least take comfort in the fact that we human beings seem to be endowed with positive human instincts, God-given human instincts, I should say. For example, I think we all agree that along with our basic instinct for selfishness, for pursuing our self-interest, all of us possess an instinct for altruism, of caring and sharing for others around us. I don't think I have met an individual who does not have this kind of an instinct, to care and share. Second, we have the instinct to value the common good, which moves us to certain behaviors that may sometimes be surprising because it does not necessarily lead us to pursue our own best self-interest all of the time. And again, this comes from that innate instinct of caring and sharing, I think. Well, this is what social solidarity economy is all about, as we like to argue. And that's why it is described as an economy where economic activities and regulations are based on cooperation and solidarity rather than pursuit of narrow individual self-interest, and therefore places human beings and relationships at the core. It is pluralist and organic in its approach, allowing for different forms and strategies in different contexts. It's open to constant change and driven from the bottom up, from the communities, whether in civil society or in the marketplace. Again, these are words that I get from our friend, Dr. Ben Quiñones, our guru. Well, as an economist, some of us economists in the group that started meeting since 2007 on this Asian Solidarity Economy, Asian Solidarity Economy Forum, we're tasked with trying to find a conceptual or theoretical base for social solidarity economy. And as an economist, I can put up this meager set of suggestions. I think many of us have heard of gross national happiness as a concept being pushed. It was championed by the former king of Bhutan, and it's now being taken up by many scholars around the world as well, including a couple of colleagues in the Ateneo de Manila University Economics Department. But happiness itself is the end-all of human behavior. It is maintained. And therefore, we have to look at how we are maximizing that happiness. The difference between mainstream economics, the neoclassical economics, is that happiness is equated to maximizing consumption and maximizing profit. In other words, happiness translates to material welfare of the self. In social solidarity economy, I maintain that happiness is both that material welfare, but more importantly, we value relationships. And therefore, happiness consists of self and others. Another important distinction is that in social solidarity economy, our unit of analysis and of intervention is the community. In neoclassical economics, it is the individual, whether it's the firm or the consumer. And the objective is always maximizing the utility or happiness of an individual or to maximizing the profit of a firm. Well, here we have to look at the community welfare as the basis, as the unit of our analysis, and maximizing the welfare of the community is really our main objective. And then a third concept that I would throw into this attempt to come up with a conceptual basis for social and solidarity economy is this term that economists have coined called satisficing. It is a combination of satisfying, to satisfy and to suffice, which is really, the meaning of this is that individuals will simply be out to achieve a minimum level of whatever brings them happiness and are able to share for the rest. Unlike the usual assumption in mainstream economics that we want to get more and more is better all the time, so that we are always going for unlimited growth. A lot of the critics of GDP measurements and growth in general is that, again, we can be so enamored with growth to forget about our relationships. And so, social solidarity economy, as we have been defining it over the years, will be operationalized by having several key elements. Socially responsible investment. We have to have investors who are willing to invest not only for maximum return, but also for maximum happiness of the communities around. Financiers who are willing to provide financing, not only to gain the most earnings or interest or return on their capital, but also, again, to look for responsible enterprises to fund. And of course, enterprises themselves that are not just out to maximize profits, but to maximize the welfare of our communities. And I don't have the time to go into examples of each, but through the years that we have been meeting together in our respective countries, internationally like this, we have always been sharing our experiences in these various socially responsible investments, finance, and enterprises. But there are overarching elements that have to be there as well. Good governance with people empowerment, and education for entrepreneurship and social responsibility. In other words, the educational system itself becomes a key factor for achieving SSE. Again, in terms of good governance, it is governance based on servant leadership, on transparency, on accountability, subsidiarity, and participation. When education, again, this touches a theme that I love. It's education that is gearing our young people not to just aspire to earn an income when they graduate, but to create wealth when they graduate. To have them aspire not to just work for others, but to create jobs for others. And that means they have to aspire to be entrepreneurs rather than just being employees. And of course, an education that promotes in the minds and hearts of our young people social responsibility and not just productivity. And so that the education that we need is one that promotes not just knowledge or gaining knowledge, but gaining wisdom, a higher order of being wherein we are able to use our knowledge to solve problems. To my mind, these are the things that we all need to have the social solidarity economy that we're all dreaming of. So in the end, let me just conclude by saying, market forces cannot guarantee the convergence or the inclusive development in ASEAN. This was in fact a statement made by the Southeast Asia Human Development Report in 2005. And therefore, national and regional level actions are important, have to be done by the different ASEAN member countries, nationally within their countries and across the region. The overall gains from our integration in ASEAN are expected to outweigh the losses, but we must provide the means for the laggards and the losers to keep apace with the winners. The Initiative for ASEAN Integration, as I mentioned, is one of those mechanisms, but we need more. Inclusiveness must be an explicit goal, not just an afterthought after looking at the effects of the free trade areas and the other modes of integration that we have been looking at. And in the end, we believe that social solidarity economy is a potent vehicle towards inclusive development within our countries and across our countries in the ASEAN. Indeed, I would say that social solidarity economy is inclusive development. Maraming salamat po. Mabuhay tayong lahat.